tell me a little bit about what your mom did?
Okay, my mother, let me go back a step. My father was in the wholesale flour business, and he died in 1928. The company went bankrupt in 1929, and thereafter a new company was formed on the ashes of the old company, and that new company employed my mother until in 1933 she was fired for being Jewish. And then she decided to visit my father's old customers and duplicate his business, but with his old customers. And she did until things got tough and pressure was put on the mills not to sell to a Jew, and pressure was put on the customers not to buy from a Jew. And that effectively put her out of business by 1938.
Did your mother talk to you about what was going on?
Yes.
What did she say to you?
Well, that's what she told me. I mean, this is where some of my wisdom comes from, by having talked with her about it.
So when did you notice yourself that things had changed, started changing?
Well, it really started in 1933 with the boycott of the Jewish-owned businesses. I remember, for example, like I said, in 32, I was sick for 6 months, and I had one of my teachers come visit me, and he was a social democrat and opposed to the Nazi regime, but he had to be very circumspect because visiting Jews was not one of the things you're supposed to do. So, I don't know, I'm kind of getting off the track.
You're fine.
What was your question?
Just when you noticed that things were changing.
Well, it kind of came home to me when I had to leave the school that I was in because you couldn't, as a Jew, attend a general school anymore. By 1936, I was 10, and I had to start in a Jewish school. And I did. It was kind of on the other side of town, and I went there on my bicycle. That's it.
Okay. So, did you and your mother and brother talk about getting out?
Yes, my mother decided with my brother that there was no future for a young fellow. He was then 19, 20 years old. There was no future for a young Jewish fellow. So she set about trying to find a way for him to get out of Germany. And this business started in 1937, and the first person she contacted was a distant relative, Louise Rayner, two-time Academy Award winner, and got a response from Miss Rayner from her secretary, saying she was sorry, but she had already made so many affidavits of support, she couldn't make any others. Then my mother went to a family tree, what do you call it, a genealogical table, and that a relative had put together, and found out that we had a couple of distant relatives in Rochester, New York, who were school teachers. And in those days, school teachers couldn't be married, if you remember those that far back. But she wrote to the sisters, the two sisters, about making an affidavit of support, and they said, oh, sure. And they made the necessary affidavit and sent it on to my mother, and my mother sent it on to the American consulate in Stuttgart, and my brother got an immediate visa for immigration to the United States. That was in 1937. He didn't go right away. He spent 3 months in England first, and returned to Germany, said goodbye, and off he went to the United States at the age of 20. Now, my mother hadn't decided anything about leaving the country for herself or for me until after Kristallnacht. Then it became obvious you had to get out. It was absolutely just a horror for the future. And she contacted those relatives in Rochester again about making new affidavits. And my brother, who was a resident of the United States, also made an affidavit of support, and those affidavits were submitted to the American consul in the summer of 1938. And that's when we got the reply that said, here's your number, you can expect it to come up in 5 years. The difference between 37 and 38 was things had gotten so tough that those people who got away out of the country left, and those who did not stayed and took the consequences. My best friend, his family stayed, and they did not get away out of the country, and 3 out of the 4 members of that family died one way or another.
Okay, do you want to drink a water before we go on? So what I want you to tell me is, how smart was your mother?
Well, apparently some very smart to read the signs and to realize that there was no future, and things were just bad, and then instead of getting better, they got worse progressively. And my brother, as a young man of 20, had to get out of the country, and then finally she and I had to get out of the country. Only it wasn't easy, you know. The United States had quotas for immigration, and I've forgotten if it was 28,000 or 38,000 for Germany. And at that time it was national origins quotas. So if you were a German, you had to fit within the German quota, and suddenly between 37 and 38, that quota was used up 5 years in advance. We went to England separately, but because of the war, the German quota was not being used, and ours was expedited, and we could leave England in the fall of 1940, which is not 5 years, but the reason for that being the war.
Did you and your mother speak about the fact that she really did save all 3 of you?
That she did what?
That she saved the 3 of you?
Well, not specifically as a saving thing. We discussed from time to time our respective histories and compared notes, but I can't say that we really thought of her as a savior.
You just figured you were lucky.
Yeah.
So do you think it's luck?
Do I think it's luck? I think it's a combination of luck and being able to read the future.
How did your mother adjust to leaving her homeland?
Well, she found it more difficult than I, because she was born in 1892. So she was, let me think, 8 and 3, about 46 years old. And, you know, as a 46-year-old person, you pretty well have a pattern of family and friends and whatnot. And she hated to leave all that. But people who had the ability to get out, got out. And people started to emigrate from Germany as early as the early 30s, when they could see what was going on. And I have an aunt who came to the United States in the early 30s, ultimately divorced her husband, but she had 3 children, two of whom were in New York. One was in South America. And these are people who got out of Germany timely, early on. But many, of course, the huge number of German Jews died in the camps because they didn't have a way out. You know, I didn't mention this but early on, but are you familiar with the tape on the Mann conference? That's very interesting, but that was kind of the turning point from making life miserable to starting to kill Jews because they were Jews. It was decided at the Mann conference, and it's a chilling kind of a video program.
How was the transition for you?
Well, how was the transition? And from which point to which point?
From the point that you gave up, you leave your home, you have to go to England, live with other people.
In the sense, it was kind of scary because I'm totally dependent on other people now, and other people who are relative strangers to me. The sequence was I lived with the Jacksons from the time I arrived on April 20, 1939, until Christmas of 1939. Their son, whose name was Basil, was put into school as a boarding student. I stayed back and stayed with the family. And I used to ride my bicycle to school, 3 miles uphill and downhill, rain or shine, and it used to do a lot of raining in England. Gas rationing did not permit them to drive me to school. But the adjustment was kind of tough because I didn't know the language. I just knew a little bit that I learned in school, and I was, as I said a while ago, I was missing certain words. I didn't know what the word battle meant. I didn't know, lots of these other things, finer points of the language I didn't have, and that made it difficult. At Christmas 1939, I went to visit my cousin, the one who had found the family in the first place. She, in the meantime, had married a Jewish doctor in England, and I visited their house, and the Jacksons concluded that they really couldn't keep me any longer. Mr. Jackson had developed a bad case of arthritis, and I was just kind of a fifth wheel on the wagon. I was no longer fulfilling the concept of being a companion for their son, because their son was a boarding student and I was a day student. I had to ride the bicycle back and forth. In any event, I stayed with my cousin for a week or two, and then they started to find other places for me to stay. And I finally ended up with the Grahams, who were a very nice couple that took me in. And I lived with them for something in excess of 6 months, 7, 8 months, until it was time for me to come to the United States with my mother on ship.
And then when you came to the United States, what was that like? At least you had learned some English by then.
Oh, yes. I spoke with an English accent. Yeah. We spent 2 weeks in New York, and then went to Cape Girardeau to join my brother, who had, in the meantime, found a job in Cape. And that was when my mother actually spent 3 months working for Professor Black, who had given her a job in England in '39. And when he got a position at the University of Illinois, he came to the United States and extracted a promise from my mother that she would help them out for 3 months. And she did. And then we were all reunited, and my mother and brother set up housekeeping in a little furnished apartment in Cape.
And did you like being in the United States?
Yeah, you know, at first I was in high school something of a celebrity, and then that quickly wore off and I became the oddball. You know, like I said a while ago, I wasn't into baseball. I didn't know from baseball until I came to this country. And my interest in the newspaper was the front page. My contemporaries' interest in the newspaper was the funnies and stories about Hollywood and whatnot. That didn't mean anything to me.
You said you were an oddity. You know, in the bigger city, do you think it's because it was a small town? Because in the bigger cities, people came and didn't talk. Mm-hmm. But it seems like maybe there was more interest in where you came from because you were in a smaller place.
Well, maybe so. I was just, I remember being interviewed by the school newspaper. And like I said, I was an oddball. I was not like the other kids.
Okay. Let's go back to Kristallnacht, and I know you told the story, but tell me, was it frightening for you?
Well,
and don't
again,
tap on the chair.
I'm sorry?
Don't tap on the chair because we'll hear it in your microphone.
Sorry. It was one of those things that didn't hit you all at one time. It was a progressive thing. You would hear things, and you came into the situation piece by piece. You didn't hear about the people's apartments being destroyed until after it happened. You didn't hear about people being arrested until after it happened. So it was a progressive thing. And as a kid of 12 and a half, maybe I wasn't exposed to a lot of it directly or immediately. The rumor mill didn't always include kids, you know. The radio, there was no television in those days, but radio didn't have much about what was going on. The Nazis characterized some of these things as the wrath of the German people. Well, you know, that was the name they gave it, and actually, I remember a friend of the family who came to visit after he was released from the concentration camp, and I remember seeing him looking gaunt, having lost a lot of weight, head shaved, looked like an atrocity victim. And he and my mother conversed in sotto voce, you know, without raising their voices for fear of being overheard, because he was told not to talk about his experiences. So he did tell her some things, and it wasn't pretty.
Okay. How did she tell you, how did she explain to you that she was going to put you on this train and send you away?
Well, I think it was with a sense of adventure that I went, with a sense of the fact that It was going to be a new experience for me. I didn't, I was a little homesick, but not terribly so. When the people were treating me decently, I responded to that. And when things got kind of hairy, then, of course, I was in a situation where I had no bargaining power. I couldn't say, if you don't treat me well, I'm leaving. Where was I going to go? I was, like I said a while ago, I was totally dependent upon other people for pocket money, spending money, for food on the table, for clothes, for whatever it is that my needs were. I was dependent on other people. And like I said, when I first came to England, my major suitcase was lost for 6 months, and it had a lot of clothes in it that I needed. And that made things a little more difficult. I don't remember who got me clothes suitable to the season, but I'm sure somebody did.
How do you think this affected you as an adult?
I really can't answer that. I really can't answer that because I'm not sure that it affected me a lot. Somewhat, of course. I would say that there was a little paranoia that you had to overcome. But I really can't answer that.
No, that's okay. Because I'm just asking and
Yeah.
going through. I want to go back to your bar mitzvah. Tell me about your bar mitzvah.
Okay, my bar mitzvah was not held in the synagogue because it had all been destroyed in Frankfurt, as well as in other parts of the country. So it was actually held in the high school auditorium. It was not a joyous occasion because, it was recently that just a few months after the Kristallnacht episodes, that was in November. My bar mitzvah was on March the 11th of 1939. And like I said, my mother had a luncheon at home in which she was able to use her silver before she had to turn it in to the municipal pawn shop. She was required to turn in her silver, all except 2 knives, 2 forks, 2 spoons, and two coffee spoons. That she was able to keep. But the rest of it, see, my mother had relatives in the silver business, so she had a lot of silver at home. And I remember she had a chest of silverware in the dining room. But anyhow, that's beside the point. The March the 11th was my bar mitzvah day. On the afternoon, early afternoon, I got this telegram that said family found, indicating that my cousin had found a family to take me in. Then my mother got busy making sure that I got onto one of the trains that took the kids out of Germany into England. And, that's itself a remarkable story, that in the short space of 6 days, after the law was passed, the first trainload of kids went out of Germany. How they managed to arrange all that, not only to get them out, but also to find a place for them to live, is a remarkable story, Kindertransport story. And the trains were going until August of 39, and just before the war started. It's an amazing story, how they were able to put the pieces together.
How many kids got out, do you know?
Yeah, just under 10,000. The law permitted 10,000, and under certain circumstances more, but then the war cut it off, and they stopped. Now, the United States didn't have a similar program. They had to go through normal immigration procedure for the U.S. That's why we were told, your turn will come up in 5 years.
All right, I'm gonna take another drink of water. You did say that that you had the strange experience of the huge weight being lifted off your shoulders. Tell me about that.
Well, that was at the time when we crossed the border from Germany into Holland, and I had that experience a second time the day that the war was over and nobody was shooting at me anymore. And it's like an invisible weight off your shoulder. I didn't realize as a child the pressures that I lived under and the uncertainties that I lived under until later years, and I became more sensitive to it. I felt it as a child that, and I left Germany, it was leaving something of a hell.
You didn't tell me about grandparents. Did you have grandparents?
Well, I had 4 grandparents, but they all died. By the time I was 2 years old, the last one died.
So, and did your mother and father have brothers and sisters that?
Okay, my mother had a sister who had polio as a child, and she was somewhat crippled by polio, and she was treated with radiation and got some radiation burns on her throat. So she was kind of messed up. My father had 2 sisters. One I mentioned moved to the United States in the early 30s, and the other one and her husband, my uncle, died in the camps. Now, the aunt that I mentioned, my mother's sister, went to live with her uncle and aunts in Frankfurt until they were deported. And the 3 of them, 3 and my aunt, all were deported to Theresienstadt. And my one aunt, the one who moved to the United States, had 3 daughters, and they all married very well. My other aunt, the one who died in the concentration camp, had 2 daughters. One moved to England, one moved to Israel. Well, it was called Palestine in those days. And that's it. That's all I can tell you in terms of relatives. Sure. I was the youngest of all the cousins, and my brother and I were the only male cousin. All the rest were females.
Let's see.
You didn't ask me about my getting married. I married in 1952, and my wife and I had 3 children, and one now lives in Memphis, one lives in Evanston, Illinois, and my daughter lives in Brookline, Massachusetts.
And any grandchildren?
Oh, yes. I have 2 grandchildren who live, both going to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And then I have a new granddaughter who was adopted from Russia. That's my daughter's daughter. And she is 3 years old. And that's the family.
That's wonderful. Tell me, have you been back to your home in Frankfurt?
Well, I saw the building from the outside, but the building where I spent most of my young years has been converted into an office building, and it's no longer a residential place. And I know I looked at it, and that's about all I could do at the time. I didn't visit, well, one of the places where we lived was destroyed by bombs. The building on the one side and the other was standing, and this one in the middle was burned out. That was
Could have been
part.
my dad doing that.
That could be.
Yeah. You were saying that when you went back to Germany, there was a little bit of, were they good German or bad German? Tell me about that feeling.
Well, you just don't know when you did, because when you go to Germany, nobody was a Nazi, until you start to dig and ask questions and engage people in conversation. And there are many Germans who are very embarrassed by their history, the history of their country, and the treatment by the Nazis of the Jews and other minorities. They, especially among the educated people, they just find that horrendous. I have some people I correspond with in Germany, and they assure me that they're not Nazis, and I believe them, because they're kind of young. This one woman is actually doing, or did her doctoral thesis on the Kindertransport. That's how I first met her.
What made you decide to start talking?
Well, I never really had any great hesitance about talking. It's just I didn't think my own personal history was particularly exciting. I mean, I never went to the camps as a prisoner, which, thank God, I was spared that. There's nothing really dramatic about my history. I didn't go into hiding. I didn't go to the camps. I didn't suffer much in the way of physical abuse. I was abused by other kids. And when I complained to one teacher, he had a swastika in his buttonhole. He could care less, I should go away and not bother him. That's about it.
Marci, do that again, okay, because he hit the microphone.
Okay.
Just
Tell me about being bothered by other kids.
Well, there's some ugly incidents. I remember one incident that was somewhat painful, where I'm on my way to school, and a gang of boys, not girls, boys, would stop me, and they would take a twig off a tree and dip it into some dog manure and then wave it under my nose. It's one of the things that boys like to do. Anyhow, that incident I've never talked about, but it wasn't a pleasant experience. And when I, like I said, tried to communicate with my teacher, I got brushed off.
So thinking about that vulnerability of a teenage boy, and now here you are at the Holocaust Museum speaking to these teenage children. Tell me why you decided to do it, what it means to you to do it, what you want them to hear.
Well, actually, I always felt an obligation to tell the story, even though my personal story was not as dramatic as that of a lot of other people. But I felt that I owed it to tell the story as best as I can, and I try not to embellish it. I try to tell it the way it was. I try to tell it for what it's worth, that for those people who are interested in hearing it.
Okay, let's do that again since we had so much noise. Tell me about speaking to the children here at the museum.
Well, I have been speaking to the children here at the museum for several years now, and I would say probably average in the last half dozen years, about 4 to 6 times a year that I speak to various groups. And it's interesting, sometimes they send me to a school, where I visit at the school. Other times the students are brought here and they're exposed to the museum and they're taught by the docents, and then they end up speaking or being spoken to by people like myself who have had some experience with the Holocaust. For a number of years, I didn't consider myself a Holocaust victim because I never was in the camps and I never had this dramatic kind of experience. But I finally convinced myself that my life was not exactly normal for many years, and that if I could add something to the understanding, that it was my obligation to do so. I will tell you one other thing that you didn't ask me about, but when I was in my mid-teens, living in England and then ultimately living in the United States, I began to question, is there a God? Because as far as I was concerned, where was he when all this persecution of innocent people took place? And I called myself an agnostic, and in more recent years, last 3 or 4 years, I decided that I was not being honest. I'm really an atheist, and I'd never denied being Jewish, and I don't deny it now. But I have a lot of difficulty with the God concept in light of the fact that if there were such a thing as a God, let the millions of people be killed for no reason at all, and it just doesn't do it for me.
Right. That's the way. What do you want the children to learn from you speaking with them?
I'm sorry?
What do you want the children to learn?
Well, obviously, I would like for them to understand and appreciate the history, and finally to draw some conclusions from that history that one needs to speak up when injustices are being done to minority groups or otherwise, so that it shouldn't happen again. That's the main motivating factor as far as I'm concerned. When children are born, and in the first few years they grow up, they're essentially cruel animals who have to be taught such things as worrying about their fellow man and not permitting ugly incidents to mold them, but rather to be concerned and continue to be concerned about their fellow man.
What lessons do you teach your children and your grandchildren about your experience?
Not much.
Do they ask you questions?
When they do, I answer the questions. But I don't volunteer very much. Probably for the same reason that I did not consider myself to be a Holocaust survivor for many years. Like I said, the people who suffered through the camps and suffered the deprivation and never had enough to eat and all that kind of stuff, they deserve to be called Holocaust survivors. And I felt, as I said a while ago, I felt that that really didn't include me. And when I realized that I really ought to speak up and consider myself a Holocaust survivor, I never felt that vis-a-vis my children or grandchildren, I would really want to volunteer a whole lot of stuff. When they ask me, I answer. But that's about
Well,
it.
the reality is, you were uprooted from your life as it was. You know, you had relatives who died. You got out. Luck, smartness, you know, your mother understanding what was happening. We know you're a survivor.
Hmm.
And that has all kinds of different implications
Mhm.
in your life and in your children's lives. So obviously, you, as you're saying, you've decided you want to tell your story, you want to share your story, and you want the kids to hear the story.
Yeah.
So where do you see the future going with the future generations?
Well, I'm not terribly optimistic about the future generations because memories are short, and people tend to forget that they are their brother's keeper, to use a biblical reference. They tend to forget, and they tend to be callous toward their. In other words, I'm not optimistic about the future. You read the newspaper, watch TV now, and you hear of atrocities here and atrocities there, and Darfur and other places where all these things are taking place, and we don't seem to have learned a lesson at all. And it just seems to be, mankind is just a bad bunch of animals. Animals, they are.
Well, fortunately, though, you're doing something.
Well, as long as I'm around, I'm doing something. But, you know, this whole concept of videotaping these things is a good move because there won't be very many years and there won't be any survivors left because they will have died off. Nobody lives forever, and I know that.
And I don't care whether you're a pessimist, an optimist, whatever, the story needs to be told. I don't care whether you consider yourself a survivor or not. So, yeah, in doing this, in speaking and doing this videotape, you are giving of yourself, of your story, to the future.
Yeah.
That in and of itself is an optimistic thing,
Yeah,
even
well-
though you're saying you're not optimistic. So,
Well, you asked me about lessons learned, and that's why I suggested what I did.
right. Anything else you would like to tell me?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered the waterfront pretty well. You got any other questions you want to ask me?
I'm looking through my notes. Let me see. I guess what I want to ask you is, does any of it make any sense to you? If you look back, and I'm looking at what I'm writing here now, you know, with Hitler coming into power and everything that happened, how do you make sense of it?
Well, let's go back in history a little bit. Germany was never terribly friendly toward Jews. There was always something of an undercurrent of anti-Semitism. Germany's army did not permit Jews to become officers. Those Jews who served in the army in World War I were served as enlisted men because they couldn't become officers. My father was born in what was Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, the western portion of Czechoslovakia. And that was, at that time, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that did permit Jews to become officers. And my father was a lieutenant, I believe. and he served in World War I. He suffered some diseases that were common at that time, and that may have contributed to his death in 1928. But the undercurrent of anti-Semitism was there in Germany, and it was like ripe for Hitler to take advantage of, and he made no secret of the fact that he hated the Jews. It was available already when he wrote Mein Kampf in 1922 or 23, whatever that precise date was, when he was in jail, in prison, I should say. And the German man in the street didn't seem to, for the most part, to fight the concept of anti-Semitism. As far as he was concerned, it was just one of those things, you know. They did it, them. They brought it on themselves. Anyhow, it's part of the history of Central Europe. Not every country was friendly toward the Jews. In fact, there were very few countries that were friendly to the Jews, and very few countries let the Jews in, because the big struggle in 38, 39 was to find a country that would let the Jews in. And we had, well, you remember the movie about the ship, the St. Louis? So people tried to get out to Cuba, but it turned out that their Cuban immigration visas were considered to be invalid, and they didn't permit the ship to land.
Well, do you feel, though, that by your speaking to these kids, you know, I feel like at least that helps change the view so that they will not become anti-Semites?
Well, I hope so.
Tell me that.
I would hope that the concept of anti-Semitism is extinguished by exposing them to the museum and exposing them to a live person talking to them about their experiences. I hope you're right. I mean, we'd all like to hope that some good comes out of the effort that we make, and that it isn't a total waste of time, yours or mine. I hope that my speaking to the kids, as I have from time to time, will leave them without any feeling of anti-Semitism, or for that matter, any other negative feeling toward a racial or religious group.